Hi, I'm John Gatewood, founder and CEO of Gatewood Wealth Solutions, where we are on a mission to help individuals and families become and remain financially self-reliant. Welcome back to our weekly Market Insights broadcast. Every Wednesday, we cover the week's top news stories related to the market, economy, and your portfolios, so you can be better informed when making decisions about your money. With me today is our Chief Investment Officer, Tuttle. Welcome back, Aaron.
John, it's good to be back.
Last week you were presenting to us from
the laundry room in Dauphin. Yes, the internet connection was not great. They said that we had broadband, and maybe a 56K modem is broadband, because I felt that this is what that was. So it was hard to find a good connection, but we were connected. Technology is awesome.
Well, we are happy to have you back in the GWS studio today, what we refer to as the green room.
The green room.
So let's start off with our themes for this year. And I know that COVID is one of the things that we have talked about a lot. We're going to talk about fewer times going forward, but there have been some significant
Yeah, let's just jump right in there. So, because it's good news, right? We're seeing the new cases really drop for COVID. Now, when we're looking at this, you normally see kind of like a parabola where it goes down at a similar speed that it came up. But if you look, something happened on January 13th, and it's almost like an elevator. So there's like a shift in the slope.
Yeah, we've been monitoring that. I look at that every day, and I've been surprised to see the steep decline in the number of cases. Why is that?
Well, it likely has to do with changes in the way that the tests are being done. So the World Health Organization put out a reduction in cycles for PCR tests. Now, we talked about this previously in one of our calls. The cycle threshold was set very high, and it was giving it was more sensitive to testing for viruses, and you would get a lot more false positives, or at least whether it was false or not, you would get more positive results on those tests. Well, they've pulled that back, and I actually believe that they're now requiring a second test to have a confirmation on that. Now, obviously, some people are saying, well, this was politically motivated on the changes. We don't know. It changes. What I can say is that the data is no longer, in statistical language, known as covariance stationary, meaning that comparing things now in the new paradigm of tests is not going to equate to what it would have if you were under the old regime. So the data is just going to be different.
Yeah. Ultimately, so how do we know what the impact is? I mean, I would assume that we probably are in a decline in cases.
Yeah, I believe that is. Right. I think, once again, we've said the more difficult component to get bad data on is death, right? It's binary, either alive or you're dead. And that is where we'll look. So we hope to see that drop in the death rate, but my guess is it'll be more of a natural decline, not that elevator. But I do think that the decline is real.
How do you think this will impact lockdowns going forward?
So we think lockdowns are over. Once again, a lot of people are saying, well, it's just politics. And, well, it's true, it is politics, but it may not be as straightforward as President Trump is now out of office, so let's open up. I can understand why people believe that. It's suspect with California, New York, Illinois, Michigan, and Massachusetts all starting to lower their restrictions and open back up. But remember, those case counts are coming down. And they are politicians, so it certainly is going to be politics. If you look at California, it's not. It may not be that President Trump left and that's why they're doing it. Governor Newsom is actually going through a recall, or is likely to go through a recall. I think they've hit 1 million votes. They need 1.2 million. Looks like they will get that, as well as some areas in California are just disregarding his mandate whatsoever. Obviously, also a political statement. They're calling them peaceful protests whenever they're meeting at the restaurants. So that is Governor Newsom's reason, likely, for trying to reduce this. If you go to Chicago Mayor Lightfoot, you could say she's also playing politics, but not in a bad way. They are going off the numbers that they set, I believe, back in November, that had specific thresholds that once they became
so they have
below that,
metrics that they're
yes, and the metrics
when they're going to open it at what level.
Yeah, and their metrics have not changed. Is she playing politics? Well, it was a political process to put those numbers in place, and she's adhering to that political process. Is she playing politics? Absolutely.
Yeah, but at least she's adhering to something which gives some consistency of a message and some certainty of expectation to people. So wouldn't you think that this will now lead to more economic good news?
It will. We think the lockdowns are over, with one exception. If we get a mutated virus, that's whenever the lockdowns would come back out. Now, there have been a lot of studies that have come out that say the lockdowns were ineffective. Like anything, though, in today's environment, somebody always can point to some type of scientific study that backs their argument up. So we do think that it's unlikely, barring a mutated virus, that we will see lockdowns come back on.
Moving to our next topic, modern monetary theory. Let's talk more about that.
So we're in policy.
Oh, we are in tax time.
Tax time. And I think all our listeners are aware that it's tax time. We definitely have gotten some calls asking, where's my 1099? And we wanted to give some dates out there. So on January 29th, any retirement accounts that have a distribution that would require a 1099 form will be sent out. LPL has already started January 22nd issuing 1099s for accounts that have simple securities, meaning it's not complex, there's not a delay in the filing for those taxes. It'll come out on the 22nd and the 29th. So if you have an account with nothing but simple securities, you're going to receive your 1099 shortly. Now, if you have more complex securities that have a delay in their filing, because remember, it's got to go through LPL to the mutual funds or the ETFs, all the way down to the company level, so there's a lot of areas that can delay this process. We tend not to use complex securities. We don't think they're really necessary, and so most people should be getting their statements. But if they don't, starting in February, every Friday there will be a batch that gets sent out each Friday. All the way to February 19th, if they don't have a document yet, they'll get a draft document. Now, a lot of people are concerned about inaccuracies on using that document. LPL did a study and only 0.7% had inaccuracies in there. So I think you're okay using that draft statement and giving that to your accountant or putting it in your tax software, and just know that you'll need to check it whenever they come out. LPL is doing a much better job than in our opinion, than Pershing on getting these statements out. But ultimately, it's not LPL that makes the call. It is the mutual funds and the ETFs and then the underlying securities that they have.
An important message for our audience, too, is to understand that these dates are driven by regulations. So these aren't just arbitrary dates that LPL or the mutual fund companies set. This is actually established by regulation. And we are very happy with what we see with LPL because we do think we'll have more accurate data than what we've had in the past.
So then, why don't we move on to the stimulus bill?
Are we going to get checks in the mail?
I think we're going to get checks. There has been some concessions on who will get checks, but we think that the stimulus bill will be lower than the $1.9 trillion price tag that was initially put out there. And
what are the potential holdups with this?
Well, we said that the $1.9 trillion is more of a negotiating tactic from the Biden administration. They know they're going to have to negotiate, so start at a higher amount so that you can negotiate down to the amount that you do want to get. But the big holdup that we've talked about is the $15 minimum wage. The Republicans and probably a lot of Democrats do not want to do that. Nationally, a lot of jobs would not be able, and small businesses who are already facing headwinds would not be able to absorb that cost. So we don't think that is going to make it through. We do think the state and taxes will make it in some fashion. One of the things that the Republican-controlled Senate would constantly tell the Democrats whenever they were pushing for some relief for state and local governments is, well, elections have consequences. And you're just going to have to pass this bill and we're not going to fund them. Well, they're absolutely going to turn that same phrase back over to them. And they're right to do so, right? They have gained seats in the House. They have the election or the electoral control of this outcome, and they're going to get what they wanted, and that's probably going to be here. So
and now we have Yellen, who is the Treasury Secretary. Talk to us about that.
So Janet Yellen, previous chair of the Fed, is now the Treasury Secretary. She was confirmed, as she should have been. Yes, she's going to be left-leaning. That's not a surprise. She's a Democrat. So she's going to view policy from a certain framework, but there would be no reason to hold her up. She's certainly competent and qualified to do the job that she's going to do. She did come out and say that she thinks the stimulus bill needs to be big. They need to act big. And she was saying that she's not so much worried about the current debt burden, though it is a problem, and she doesn't think that corporate taxes and tax change is something that needs to be done at the moment. Instead, we need to have big spending. So yes, so we're going to probably see a smaller stimulus bill, but remember, as soon as that one's done, there's likely going to be a $3 trillion infrastructure bill that's proposed that will have a lot of bipartisan support as well. So there's still a lot of spending that's going to come out of the government.
She had some commentary about cryptocurrency as well.
Yes, she did. So one of the things she had mentioned, and I think her statement, everyone can agree, is that she wants to encourage their use, watch it closely, and make sure it's legitimate activities, that they're curtailing any of the illegal activities. Well, you could say the same thing about cash, right? You want to curtail illegal activity there as well, because a lot of notorious stuff is done with cash, and you can't just say that cash is bad because of that.
Wouldn't this make you think that they're eventually going to regulate?
I think that's what they are doing, is they're setting up the realm, and if they don't want a competing currency against them. And if you go back to the 1930s, when we were we were on a gold standard, you could request your gold. They made that illegal. So I think that's going to be a thing for cryptocurrency. And ultimately, a lot of people ask, what is our view on cryptocurrency? We certainly think that the momentum it has, it can continue to go higher, probably likely would go higher. We'd refrain from using any money that you can't lose to purchase anything like that, because ultimately we think there's going to be a regulatory risk.
Which you don't really know what the impact of that is going to be on the pricing or something like that.
But what has us concerned, and it's not with the Democrats, it's not with Janet Yellen, because the Republican Party, President Trump, they were all on board with these concepts, and that is that modern monetary theory.
Yes.
And there are a few tenets, 3 of them, that we think really define what modern monetary theory is.
Let's go through those.
And that is merging the Treasury, so now Yellen is the Secretary of Treasury, and the Federal Reserve, or the ability to actually print money up. And it's merging those two, where the federal government is no longer through the Treasury going to go out to the market and borrow money from savers and fund the government through that. Instead, they're going to go to the Federal Reserve, who is no longer just backstopping the banks, but will actually print the money and give it to the Treasury to spend. And we've been doing that. I would say that tenet's there. It's probably worth noting, though I don't think it's Yellen's fault by any means, this would happen whether she was there or not, that we now have a Fed chair sitting as the Treasury Secretary. I just think that's part of the time that we're in, that it happens that way. The second idea is back to that cryptocurrency. The way this works is everyone has to be recognize one type of currency as a medium of exchange. There's no alternative. And cryptocurrency, I think, is acting as an alternative currency right now. A lot of people are going to that with the fear of the dollar and the amount of money that is being created in the system. And finally, it's the statement that there's no practical limit to the amount of debt that can be issued. It's not to say that you would not need to pull back or slow down if there's inflation, but you can print as much money over the long term, and ultimately it doesn't matter, because you can always pay your debt back if you can print the money to pay it back.
Some of the ideas that come to my mind in looking at these 3 points is, first of all, the Federal Reserve was created to be an independent party, or an independent entity, body. So how does this get impacted when we think about those two acting as one?
Well, it certainly would remove that that independence from the current central bank. They would be actively, and have been, they have a lot of tools where they can go in and just purchase government securities, and it's no longer just setting the interest rate at the window. I'm sorry to use technical terms, but it's just the very beginning cash, where they're loaning money as a lender of last resort to banks, and they're keeping that Fed window rate at a certain amount.
So the window refers to when banks borrow money from the Fed itself,
yes,
directly. That's what the window is, and that's the
and that's really short-term
rate.
Cash.
Right.
So it's the interest on short-term cash. It's not on the interest rate on treasuries where you're long-term. Well, they now will use their tools to help keep that long-term rate down. They haven't been doing it, so they've been letting the interest rate on the long end of the curve increase, but they now have the powers to do that.
The other thing that comes to mind is the fact that there's no limit on the amount of debt that can be created. I know that in 2008, Janet Yellen was saying that the reason we were able to create so much debt, especially during this pandemic period where we had all these extraordinary packages, is that we're actually paying less in interest payments than we were in 2008 simply because of the low rate interest that we're, the low interest rate period that we're in today. How is that going to roll out into the future, and how does that fit into our long-term view about capital asset prices in the future?
Well, if you look at the maturity on the treasuries, they're not very long dated. So if interest rates begin to increase, yes, they may be lower and you may be paying less despite the interest, the debt being higher. If they start to mature, I think it's at 3 or 4 years out, and all of a sudden we go to 4% on the short end of the curve, that's going to be a significant problem, to the point that it would probably consume all the non-discretionary spending revenue that we have for the government. So we can't even meet the non-discretionary without borrowing. Everything that is being consumed is discretionary at that point because the interest rate is legally required to be paid. So it is a problem. Janet Yellen says that that isn't a problem. This is not beating up on Democrats because we're here after a very big spending Republican in office.
Right. This is not a political party issue.
No, this is a country
every
problem.
Party, yes. Every party subscribes to this
but
same
we
policy.
are now, as of the time of this snippet, at $27.8 trillion in federal debt. We will be over $30 trillion by the end of the year if those 2 stimulus bills are passed. And if we just look out 4 years, so just at the end of the term, President Biden's current term, 1 year or 1 term away, it's projected to be at $49.4 trillion.
So that's almost double where we are today.
Right.
What's causing the acceleration of the debt over the next 4 years?
Well, over the next 4 years, there's likely the additional stimulus. There's unfunded liabilities on the Social Security payroll that are becoming on balance sheet. There's a lot of things that are going, and the government continues to spend. Now they're doing it because interest rates are low, and a lot of people would say, "Well, look at that, $4.8 trillion added in 2020. This is the deficit spending for the government," and that certainly was astronomical. Once again, we'll probably spend that, if not more, just based on the legislation proposals for additional stimulus that's on the books right now. And so we could say, yes, this could be a one-off event, but typically, once the government spends a certain amount of money, they tend not to go back. They always spend more, and that projection on that debt clock shows that. And we can also look and say, well, what is a global debt? Because it's not just the U.S.
Right. This is not.
This is a global problem.
That's just here in our country.
We were at $277 trillion of debt at the end of last year, globally. Now, I want to explain how big of a number that is. That if during the pandemic, it was very good for Amazon. Jeff Bezos, his net worth increased $321 million a day. A day.
Can we just get one of those days?
Yeah,
and we can add it to our client portfolios?
I'll take an hour. So at that rate, it would take 863,000 days to pay off the $277 trillion, or 2,364 years. If Jesus was making $321 trillion and then we had that debt, it still wouldn't be paid for. That's how much debt is out there. And look at the slope line on that. It hasn't changed. It's not the coronavirus that caused a big jump in that. We can see that. And it's projected to continue on through 2030.
How is it that economists see this and don't see this as a problem?
Well, they think that the inflation can help offset it because there is this belief that modern monetary theory is viable and a legitimate component and a way to think of modern monetary, or the current monetary system. That no, we can just continue to fund this. It's not a problem because we can't. So I think a lot of economists have bought into that, and it's worked so far. Now, I think there are reasons that it's worked. That is, you can't have this much expansion in the money supply without real things happening in the economy that makes us far more productive. But at some point, the diminishing returns on that new technology begins to slow,
right,
and that's when we're going to have the problems.
Talked about before,
right,
is that the technology and the deflationary effect that that's had has really helped this to
right,
be able to be continued policies, so to speak.
If we were doing this and we were not in that type of environment, we would see inflation already, and that would have already stopped or slowed this. And that's ultimately going to be. And when it does happen, we're likely to see a major correction, 2008 or greater. When
Looking at this then, how do all the countries compare in terms of their total debt and their GDP?
Right. So we can look at the U.S., and we're about 130% of our federal debt, our national debt, versus our GDP. If you add in all the other assets, especially if you add in the unfunded liabilities, we're certainly very high relative to our GDP. But there's a lot of movement of things that keep things off balance sheet. Like China has a 53% debt ratio. Well, that isn't true because of the way that they keep things off balance sheet. They're actually somewhere around 335%. So it's across the globe. By the way, if you think
is not real,
if you think 53% is a good number, that's where we were in 2000. We were about 59%.
wow.
So
That's a huge increase.
yeah, and it's happening globally. The developed countries, like Japan, I think is certainly the highest on their on liability and probably also off liability. It's a problem. It just has not shown up yet. It eventually will.
The last time we were at this level, that was right after World War II. Do you remember what that level was? I think it was some large percentage. In fact, I think it might have exceeded GDP or close to it at that point.
But a lot of that was war spending that was coming off. There was not nearly the amount of liabilities that were already written in. Remember, the Social Security,
Right.
part of this is those unfunded liabilities are coming up. So I don't think it's a good comparison to say, well, this was World War II. We haven't done World War III. Why are we at this situation, and what happens if we have another crisis?
You mentioned that inflation is a way to make this work,
Well,
if it works.
that's the way that they're going to try to get out of this problem, because we at the current economic level that we're at, with the way that the GDP is the number that they're having, we can't pay that off, right? We talked about the $321 million that Bezos was making today and how long it would take off. We can't do it.
You know what? One of the things that we hear from our clients is, they say inflation is low, but everything I'm buying seems so expensive.
Well, that's that chart here on the left. We can see that red line. That's the 2% target by the Fed. And you can see how many things are above that. And it's all the things that you buy. So it's food and housing and fruits and vegetables, communication, alcohol, non-alcoholic beverages, all the things that you're buying at home. So what's below that? Well, gasoline. We're not driving as much. Airline fares. We're not traveling as much. But now that we're going to this reopen where the lockdown is likely going to pass and it slowly will roll off, those things are probably going to start getting attention, right? And I don't think people are going to buy less food. So
Probably not.
We're probably going to see that inflation start to actually move up. And
I see in there medical care and prescription drugs is below the target inflation, which is interesting because that's been
we've been in a
very high.
pandemic, right? But elective surgeries and other things where you were going to your doctor, all of the things that you would have done in a normal situation are not being done now. We're probably going to have an increase in the amount of cancer deaths in the future because people are not getting their screening. All these elective surgeries were not being used. Actually, if you go out to the rural areas where the pandemic didn't hit as hard because they don't have the higher population, there's a lot of hospitals that are in dire straits. I've seen somewhere up to 800 hospitals are nearing bankruptcy through this pandemic. So just because we had a pandemic doesn't mean that the entire hospital system is doing well and getting a lot of demand. That's not to say that there were not hospitals that were not at capacity or overcapacity or did not experience different things. It's not an aggregate number. You got to get into the detail.
Right. It's going to be focused on those areas where you had a higher case rate.
And then if we look at kind of going through that aggregate to detail, if we were just to switch the way housing or shelter is calculated in the current CPI, we'd be at 3%. So if we looked at housing prices and not rent equivalents and use that number in the CPI, we'd actually see the CPI is well over target at 3%. And then we can even look at commodities. So steel, it's been this high or higher in 2008, but we're now off of $900 and now at $1,300. That's a 33% increase in a very short amount of time. And in 2008, there was a lot of inflation, and prior to the 2008 crisis, early in that year, the economy was, at least in the commodities section, was booming. We're not there right now. So to already see prices increase there is, we think, problematic.
Looking at all these things, the debt, the amount of monetary theory, the escalation of the amount of money that's going to be owed, it makes me think about our mission, where we are helping individuals and families become and remain financially self-reliant. It's that remain part that I'm concerned about, because if all of this stuff will lead to an ultimate correction or big correction, which we certainly feel is possible, not immediate, but it's something that will happen in the future. How do we protect our clients or help them to remain financially self-reliant so they don't lose asset values that will mean that they won't be able to live the lifestyle that they were hoping to enjoy in the later years of life?
Right. It's not a doom and gloom scenario. Yes, the debt is unsustainable, and anything that can't go on forever won't. So what do we do to protect clients' net worth or assets? And there are things that we can do. So if we're looking at this is from JP Morgan, it's a great chart, and we start to say, well, what about an area where we have high and rising inflation? What are some of the areas that do well? And we can see equities do well. You don't want to be in bonds or cash if we're in a high and rising inflation environment. Commodities and gold do well also. We're not in a high inflation environment at the moment, but even if we were and we were in a falling, we can also see that equities still do well in a high and falling inflation. Commodities, gold, they tend not to. Bonds are rallying usually because they're discounted in the future. So it's not a bad thing to start picking up bonds whenever you're in a high inflation where inflation is dropping. Think of the 1980s. That was a bull market for bonds all the way for the last 30 years. And an environment that we think we're moving into is we're in low inflation, a low inflation environment with rising inflation. And you can see equities, the green is where you want to be, but commodities and gold are strong assets to be in. And what could be a possibility is that we're in low and we're going to remain in low where we had falling inflation. Once again, equities are doing well. Commodities are struggling. Gold is positive, but you'd rather be in bonds than gold in that environment. So when we look at it, well, we know we're not in high inflation at the moment. So let's just remove those and then focus on the two low. Well, if we're in low and inflation environment, whether falling or rising, small cap does well. Growth does well. Emerging markets does really well in the rising inflation, and so does commodities and gold. But you can see in the falling inflation, they do not. So we can see here. So what we are in our portfolios, we are overweight the things that do well in either environment. We're overweight in small cap. We're overweight in growth names. We have a neutral weight in emerging market equity. We do think the rising inflation is a more likely scenario, but no crystal ball. We make mistakes. We miss things. So we're neutral because it could be that they're not going to perform well. Emerging markets tend to be commodity-heavy companies, so that's why there will be some type of correlation if inflation is dropping and commodities do poorly. We're also neutral commodities. Once again, we think the rising inflation is more likely. So we're overweight the areas that will do best in those environments, either low or rising, and that we're neutral weight in the areas that will do well only in rising, but we think that's the most likely outcome.
What I think I hear you're saying is that the place to be in today's economic environment is in equities. If you're in other asset classes, you're at risk of not keeping pace with inflation.
Yes.
And maybe even losing value. Now, what is different though, because these are historical returns that we're looking at. Is there anything fundamentally different about the asset classes now that may make us look at this differently?
Yes, so if we would look at real estate, Real estate does well in an inflationary environment, and at 9%, even in the low inflation or declining inflation, they do well. But we think that there are fundamental headwinds with real estate, with the work from anywhere policies, the move away from urban to rural, and also the move away from the blue states to some of the red states, the moves from San Francisco, New York to Miami and Texas. We would not be surprised, based on current trajectory, if Miami becomes the financial capital of the U.S. the way things are going now. Now, we just don't take rulers and write a trend line and say it's done and over, because things can change. But we do think that there's a fundamental difference for real estate. But ultimately, it's not that we're looking back at historical trends and say, oh, that's a crazy phenomenon. Why? Let's buy small cap. It always does well. There's a fundamental reason why it does well, and it's that small cap companies tend to have the ability to continue to grow market share, and they have a new product that is sought after, and they can raise their prices on that product so they can offset the inflation and grow their revenue at a faster rate. Because they have a needed product, plus they can push those prices off, where other companies, let's say a value company or certainly bonds, are not able to push off those price increases. So there's a fundamental reason. Same thing with growth companies. So we're not just looking at the historical and saying, let's. It's always worked this way. Why wouldn't it work again that way, right? So.
We are now in earnings season.
Let's
talk about how those are showing up in our...
122 names are going to report this week. Several already have. Microsoft reported at the end of the bell yesterday. So did Starbucks. Microsoft did well. They beat expectations and increased in after hours. A lot of that cloud computing helped bolster them. Starbucks struggled on their revenue because of the Q2 lockdown. But their earnings beat. So we're going to take a dive into that income statement and figure out how is it that your revenue went up, but went down, but your earnings went up. There's probably some
slashing expenses. That's usually what happens.
Something is going on there, but we still have other companies that are reporting. A lot of names. Visa is reporting. So we're continuing to watch. I think this is the biggest earnings week out of the earnings season that we're in. So continue to watch.
All these earnings seem to be reflected in the market, because the market is now at an all-time high again. And we always hear, as usual, oh my God, how's it going to go higher? It can't go higher.
Well, one, these earnings are coming in above expectations in the most part. But yeah, no, we're looking at the market. We can see that it's very frothy. Eventually this slide will catch up with us. But it seems to continue to climb that wall of worry. Well, why? Because we're seeing things like GameStop. Those people that are following the financial news, I'm sorry that you're doing that. And we got this short squeeze with the gains in GameStop and Bed Bath and Beyond. Companies that are just not fundamentally sound, and they're double, triple. We have a short squeeze going on, and things like this happen when the markets are overvalued. They do. But when markets are overvalued, the Fed tends to slow the money supply growth, and we get the correction because we no longer have all this excess money flowing in.
And I think that's exactly why people are concerned, because they know that this happens. This is general knowledge, right?
Yes, it happens, and it's a precursor to the correction, and because of that, the Fed begins to tighten, because there's like, this thing's getting overheated. Let's tighten and slow this down.
Are we going to have a correction?
But it doesn't look like the Fed is going to tighten. They're wanting to push forward with these new tools. We have the stimulus package. I'm not saying that there isn't a correction. Actually, we would welcome it. It would kind of take some of this craziness out of the market, and it's needed. We just don't think it's likely, considering the Fed policy and the continual spending in the market. So we think the craziness is here for a while until we see a slowdown.
You would have to imagine, if we're at $27 trillion in debt and we're going to increase that by another $22 trillion over the next 4 years, asset prices are going to go up.
Right.
Where else is that money going to go?
The whole point of doing this was to prevent price discovery, to keep assets elevated, or levitated is probably a better word, and the Fed does not seem to want to slow down. They once again want to act big on this. They would rather see inflation, because they feel like they can deal with that, and that helps the debt problem go away. So
that leads us to the other concern that we've had, is the price of the dollar.
Yes.
Because from an economic theory standpoint, as you increase the money in the system, that then decreases the value of the dollars in the system.
Yes.
But it's happening everywhere. So explain to us this chart and how we would view that.
Right. So the U.S., since the crisis, has created more dollars than many others. But once again, $277 trillion. It's not just the United States that is doing this. Everyone's doing it. So comparing the U.S. dollar relative to other currencies, it's a race to debase is the phrase that comes to mind. And you really should be measuring it against gold, or right now that's not working because Bitcoin has become that alternative currency. So maybe you should be measuring it against Bitcoin. I don't think that that's going to be as lasting as gold, but it is kind of a zany world. We do think the dollar will depreciate relative to other currencies, but other currencies are doing just the same thing. So it's not just as easy. Nonetheless, a cheaper dollar should make our exports cheaper and our imports more expensive. So it will counterbalance it, but the cost is a lower standard of living for many people.
Looking at the relative strength index for last week, we see that the S&P 500 has actually not done as well as other asset classes. Let's talk about that.
For the last decade, the S&P 500 has continually been the place to be. You don't want to own international. You don't want to own anything else. Just buy the S&P 500. Or actually, just buy the Qs. Just buy growth, the growth side of the market, and that has worked. Now, technology and growth still is positive, but the S&P continues to drop further down. And then look what has been working: small cap, mid cap technology, things that we're overweight in. Once again, let's go back to that low inflation, rising inflation, and we're seeing that that's playing out. And we can. The other area that's doing well: emerging markets. Commodities are just above the S&P 500.
One of the analogies that you used in the past about rebalancing is cutting your flowers and watering your weeds.
Absolutely.
So in other words, why would you get out of the things that are flowering and then go into the things that are weeding?
Right.
So,
we would much rather just continue to water our flowers and try to get our weeds out.
well, it looks like we're out of time. Thanks again, Aaron. As always, your insights have been wonderful, very enlightening. And our goal, of course, is to sift through the noise so our clients can be, and our listeners can be better informed when making decisions about their hard-earned money. Mm-hmm. So if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the GWS YouTube channel. Just click the bottom right hand of your screen. There's a button there, and you'll be alerted to our future broadcasts. And finally, we'd also love to hear from you, whether it's to share feedback, ask a question about your portfolio, or learn more about engaging our firm. Please call the number on your screen, and someone will be in touch with you from our team shortly for a complimentary, confidential conversation. Thanks again, and we look forward to having you join us next week for our Market Insight broadcast. And Aaron, you'll be with us again next week too, and we look forward to having you as well. Back in the studio.
You're going to keep me around?
We decided that you get to have an extended contract for an indefinite period of time.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.